But to have that as a hub, when you're only thinking about students and everyone seeing each other as competitor, that may not be feasible. So do you have any other sort of good practices or other models of how hubs would have been would make more sense from an education point of view, perhaps?
I think, my outlook on these projects is fairly pessimistic in a way, because I feel a lot of the sort of economic development goals, if you want, are hard to achieve through these. So if they're successful, they're good at reputation and branding of the city-state that they're in. Often these are sort of non-democratic regimes with limited academic freedom. And so in many ways, if they function well, they're sort of seen as enclaves of liberal thought, of more freedoms at large.
Correct.
And so I think that's a strategy in the Middle East, but to some extent maybe also in Singapore. And so but they cost a lot of money. So these are not revenue-making efforts at all. It's hard to establish the exact figures, but Qatar is surely pouring in more money than it is ever going to get out of these projects. And this is not about getting direct money out, but maybe getting a World Soccer Championships in, let's say, because you build the credibility through this project.
Correct.
And the same with, I think Singapore is also not making financial profits at this stage, but is actually thinking of higher education as a stepping stone towards realizing other goals. I think Dubai is closest to Malaysia in terms of having this rather market-oriented policy of enabling universities to set up and to make revenue. And there you can see it's mainly international business degrees that are being offered. There's a high level of competition between the actors. And so in many ways, it's more similar to the Malaysian case. And there I also haven't seen how that would spiral into more research activities necessarily. I think Dubai looks like a place that has been able to gain international students. And here again, it's the trickiness of understanding the term international students in many ways. And I think what happens in Dubai is that it's a multi-ethnic society in many ways, in the sense that a lot of people who study there are second generation migrants whose parents have migrated, and they haven't gotten citizenship rights or anything, but they do live in the country and they study basically in their country of origin, and they are excluded. And there is a parallel maybe to the Malaysian system again, from the public universities in many ways. So there's a large number of Indian students, for instance, Pakistani students, and they are in many ways they're local in the sense that they study in their place of birth.
Okay.
But often they don't speak Arabic, for instance, and they can't enroll in the public universities. So for them, there's this market in a similar way, maybe that it originated as Jack said in the Malaysian case, that there was unmet domestic demand in many ways for higher education that could only be fulfilled through migration, through outward international student migration. And so by bringing in the institutions, that has helped in that sense. But I think in the figures, it's hard to understand what percentage of international students are in Dubai are students who actually travel in and migrate or become mobile for the purpose of studying, which would be the OECD definition of international students. So it could be that the figures look much higher than they are in reality. And that often happens when then sort of Malaysian strategies orient themselves on the model of Dubai, which was successful in attracting so many international students. The question is, were the students maybe already there, and were institutions brought in to prevent out migration?
Yeah, this reminded me the the definition that the first time this university ranking was launched in 2004, people like me were counted as international students because they were counting all the Chinese and Indians in our public universities as international students. Right. But
yeah, I read about this in Jack's paper, right? This was a big part of the,
the UN case study.
Yeah, Jack,
story.
Yeah, I just want a very interesting discussion. I just want to jump in to say I'm less concerned about co-location, perhaps because I'm not a geographer. But the reason I say this is because I think coming from higher education, the co-location part is not particularly important for teaching. In the case of many of these education hubs currently, and many of you pointed out, it's heavily focused on teaching.
yes,
I think co-location becomes an issue, as Jana has said earlier, when it comes to research. And certainly if you take any simple university, they prefer to locate similar research areas together. That's why we have research centers, right? And you also know for sure during the pandemic, many of us stopped going to conferences now. We are now having online meetings. It is not a duplication. We cannot replicate that kind of networking. I'm not going to dinners with you, having coffees with you in the hallway. So we miss a lot of that. And I think it's damaging for research, more so than for teaching. So perhaps the only one that's really doing it is Singapore. But I completely disagree with this linear progression, this modernization theory of hubs. I don't want people to think, well, Singapore is the model that we should all aim for. I think it's completely not true. It's perfectly fine if you wish to focus on, students. That's great. My concern is not about co-location, but actually the separation of the system in the case of Malaysia. The private side, which is where, as TNE falls, and the public side have become two parallel universes. They don't integrate really at all. And is this the hub project you want? Issues of access and equity, who goes where, no one talks to the other sector. This becomes a huge problem, perhaps 10, 20 years later, right?
Great. So let's move a little bit into.
Sorry, can I ask, since okay, this is triggered by Jack's remarks. So educate me here. So the original content of Education Hub is a migration perspective, or a higher education idealistic perspective, or something else?
Education
now you're
Hub?
making me. Okay, it's a migration perspective. I mean, the original definition or conceptualization of the Education Hub itself, is it a migration point of view, or is it a higher education studies point of view?
I would say it's rooted in student mobility.
Okay.
Interest and concept of student mobility.
It's the movement on student body rather than the general discipline itself. Because if you notice the progression of the definition and the concept of the hub, it started with the movement, and then suddenly we are looking at, okay, can this city, if I put in a set of funds to bring in the institutions, can it raise 5 times or 10 times more of the figure? So it moves from just a mere student figure body calculation to multiplier and some other benefits.
Definitely, in the case of Malaysia, that is true.
Okay.
I don't know if you recall, but actually in early Education Hub literature, there was a discussion about the archipelago version versus the Acropolis. So the concentrated
I missed out that
version
one, so I need to take note.
But no one really talks about that anymore. Perhaps it's less interest in that kind of distinction.
Mm-hmm. But it's very much rooted in the economic dimension of you need to bring people together, have that economic of skills, that's where you share facilities, reduce costs, so that we can increase the numbers without increasing our overhead costs and things like that. And tie that, I mean, the whole discussion is very much also talking about international investment, international players coming in. In fact, my first encounter with a education hub, so to speak, in higher education before I, in fact, begin to have an interest in higher education was when I was visiting China as a postgraduate student. I was in Guangzhou, and I went to Sun Yat-sen University. Sun Yat-sen University in Guangzhou is actually in an area where 7 other universities is actually located. And these 7 universities were all Chinese universities. There's no element of thinking about international students or bringing in people, but essentially is putting together all the universities, giving them that physical closeness for different universities with different focus, because the Chinese university systems, many of the universities are very focused on certain disciplines. It's less comprehensive as what we have. So that the whole idea is to bring the 7 universities in the same province together so that they can interact and also for the students to be able to benefit from interaction with people from different universities, so on. But that model don't seems to have been replicated in the context of higher education without bringing in the international dimension or international collaboration.
Yeah, I would add it would be like Boston or California.
Correct. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's what I didn't get to with my last statement about like successful ideas. I think they're not in the realm of these kind of planned transnational education zone projects, or they're not based around the idea of transnational education necessarily. But what actually works well is more often sort of regional universities in more peripheral regions that actually do then, through their graduates and through their linkages with domestic firms maybe and sectors, are actually able to contribute in much more substantial ways to regional economic development strategies than the kind of sort of top-down internationalization focused plans that are way more costly and even just logically have a harder time to achieve the same outcomes if we think about the teaching only character and so on. So in the advisory work I do, it's often to advise actors to look around their own regions first and see what kind of actors they can connect with, rather than reaching out sort of for international universities who have often profit motivations when they set up these subsidiaries abroad, because even if they come from countries where the systems aren't marketized very much, these international branch campuses are always commercial entities, and that's regulated by the GATS agreement and the General Agreement on Trades and Services. So even German universities, which are public universities, not profit oriented, we don't charge tuition fees, become very different animals once they're transported. And they set up a branch campus because there's then certain laws that say, well, they're not allowed to send any money from Germany because it's tax money from Germany to these places. So they are founded as corporations. And they need to at least sustain themselves and often have a profit interest. So in many ways, they become very different just through the transformation by crossing the borders. And so often then there's also a conflict of interest between the sending institution and local government or policy making at that scale. And you can have that with regional and domestic players as well, but they're way more grounded in their areas, and the level of friction might be less. So in that sense, if we look at places like Jack said, Boston, for instance, San Francisco, the history of how institutions went there is quite different.
Correct. Let's I know for the fact Malaysia has experienced tremendous changes because of COVID pandemic and the lockdown. We are still under a lockdown situation here. Our borders are still technically closed to most people, except for very very exceptional circumstances that you're allowed to travel. That has indirectly brought two challenges or two variables into this whole thinking of international hub in the context of Malaysia. One is that international students are not coming in. Our border is still closed. They can come in now slightly, they can begin to apply, but it's still relatively slow. So which means that for the 1.5 years, Malaysia, technically no international students have come in. Although they might have registered, like I have started like 3-4 students recently who started their PhD with me, but physically they are still in their own country. And that leads to the second question, is that if this restriction of travel is to be a permanent feature, let's assume that it's a permanent feature, how would this concept of hub change? Because technically now you can be registered in Malaysia as a PhD student, but you remain for the next 4 years sitting at home in, let's say, a country in let's say in China, right? And technically you can do a PhD, graduate from a Malaysian university, and you've never set foot into Malaysia. So that can already happen. It perhaps unimaginable, let's say 20 years ago. It's only imaginable for people who's doing their PhD at an open university, for instance, right? But now it's becoming the mainstream discussion. And how would that change that idea of an education hub for Malaysia? Maybe some of your thoughts from all of you.
I'll just jump in. I think my immediate concern is that we are moving from what we consider international education as an experience, right? The cultural dimension, learning about Malaysia, living in Malaysia, to a transactional. And we even see it here in UK. Some of our international students are not physically in UK due to the pandemic. This has become almost like I pay to get a degree, right? This experience has been reduced by pandemic to be very transactional. So we perhaps need to think about more creative ways of how to change that so that is not a transaction.
Definitely, yeah.
I mean, I wondered about the effects, the impacts, let's say, but also the strategic reorientation of international branch campuses, particularly with respect to the COVID pandemic. And we also ran a survey to understand it better, what the implications are. And that could also be relevant for Malaysia. And there were also responses from Malaysia in the survey. And I think, for one, these are impacted even more than, let's say, regular universities, because in many ways they rely more on these transnational flows that I outlined earlier, right? So capital flows weren't restricted, but of course, flying faculty, international students in many ways, and then of course, international branch campuses differ in terms of their student profile. If they focus primarily on the domestic market, it's basically so on the one hand, you could say, well, international branch campuses were struggling before in many ways, and the COVID pandemic might be giving them the final push. So you spoke about University of Reading or some other universities who've had a hard time recruiting, had financial difficulties prior, and then of course you can think of the pandemic then being the final push basically for this model. The second experience is, well, we can do everything online. Why do we actually need to invest in physical spaces to begin with? This is also makes the whole investment more risky for universities, and maybe that's not necessary to actually have these engagements. But there's a different level to this, and some counterintuitive ideas may be related to that, and that is if branch campuses are set up to serve domestic students in view of them becoming international students, then of course this model has worked particularly well in the pandemic, and enrollments may have even gone up because students who were supposed to go abroad couldn't, and they were stuck in their home countries. And I think in Malaysia that is quite a substantial proportion of students who would study in the UK and now could enroll at UK campuses in Malaysia. And I think in many ways this has served the institutions who've set up campuses very well, because they're lacking kind of the income streams from international fee-paying students, and they might not have all of them enrolled because they wanted the actual international student experience, but by saying, well, we do the first year at the branch campus and then we move on, they might still decide to keep enrolled and pay the fees for an international university. So that element of the story means that for universities that had set up branch campuses, especially those that had a network of campuses in different places, they enabled business continuity and enabled for the university to be able to function and to draw in international students and their fees for the time being. And so I think it's been like almost an insurance or a risk mitigation strategy in terms of having multiple locations around the globe. And I can't imagine, I'm an optimist, I can't imagine a future where with 20 years from now, we still live under lockdown conditions and there's no international travel. But I do think that the experiences we've made over the past 1.5 years will also change our mindset of what is possible and how to organize higher education. I think some of these thoughts will probably remain. And I could see a future where the experience of you don't necessarily need to have large campus infrastructures, but having networks of places where students can sort of tap in and have blended learning, or are able to follow courses abroad, but also have a student community domestically, locally. I think these kind of mixed experiences could become more prevalent, and that would mean not the abolishment of full-scale international branch campuses, but rather building upon these strategies of having smaller infrastructures, multiple locations, well-connected online systems and online learning opportunities, abilities to do shorter exchanges for the cultural experience, but not kind of the deep, I go 1 year abroad type of experiences. But what we see with certain master programs, for instance, right? You study 6 days in one campus and then 6 days in another campus, and you get a global MBA kind of experience. And I don't think that will be on a massive scale, but I think it could serve for a reorientation of the branch campuses we have already, and rather like we won't see an abolishment. And so the question would then be, where does Malaysia fit into there? And I think because there are many potential international students from Malaysia going elsewhere, I think this could also be a role to sort of be part of these networks that enable different mobilities. But this is really sort of very, very open thinking about the future.
Yep.
Rather than data.
Good, jump in. Yeah.
Following into the reimagining track that Changda has started, it might go either one of these two ways. Number one, I'm an enterprising entrepreneur. I open up, I rent a building. I send my staff to do collaboration with a whole host of universities from different countries. And then my building is a center for these students of these universities to come in and study. So should I call myself a international branch campus? Because essentially I'm just delivering a service from one institution to another. That is situation one. Situation two, it might revert back to the original intent, at least for Malaysia context, where we are coming back to the situation where it's too expensive to go out, or it's too dangerous to go out. So let's bring in like a close partner I think Monash happened that way. Swinburne happened that way. There's another one, Curtin also happened that way. So then the relationship grows deeper rather than it's an expansion of services and offerings. So too early to tell. You know, one strategic plan done 1 year ago is dead because of COVID. So I don't know.
I think that my hypothetical situation is also not realistic because Europe is technically open, right? If you watch the weekend footballs and the stadiums are packed, everyone doesn't even wear a mask anymore. Whereas we are still on a lockdown, we can't still go into campus and all this. So technically, my friends since last year, I mean, I have students and friends who got offers to do their masters in the UK, was flying into the UK last year to do their masters, and they are almost finishing now. They have difficulty coming back because they have to go through a series of quarantine, but they were not required to even be quarantined when they were in the UK, when they arrived in the UK. So we at the moment it's just that we are stuck here, and I think the different stages of opening will have a different implications to that movement of mobility of people. But Jasvir, go ahead. Yeah, you wanted to say something?
Just want to say the UK is going to get into lockdown again. The cases are terrible there. And, you know, when we are discussing Malaysian case study, Singaporean case study, I was thinking about Australia. Australia is also same like Malaysia. We are all locked down. We are all far away from every country, and international students are not coming in. And I like the idea, based on my research on international students, they seek international education to experience international life. And we cannot emulate that via online. I'm a strong believer of that. Because if I was an international student myself, and now I'm an international academic, I want to experience international life. Although I was not talking to domestic students, we know there is two camps. The study that I'm doing now as well, international students are stuck back home, and they cannot speak to the domestic students via online. Like now when we are having group assessments as well in my own classes, it's so hard for them to connect because of time zone. You don't see each other, the personal connection, like what Jag was saying, that we don't conference anymore. It's where if you have online, you just go and present yourself and then you go off. I will not stay for another session because of time limitation, time zone, and it's just that the expansion, the span of your attention is very short online. Like now itself, already we are already tired already. Like, you know, we are online for 1.5 hours right now.
Yep.
So how can then we reimagine or reorientate international education? That's a very interesting. And I was talking to Dr. Amrita, and she was saying that in Chinese, in branch campuses in China, they are employing international academics who have never stepped into a campus there. That is another interesting research that I'm thinking of. Like, oh my God, you're teaching students, but you have never been into the campus, and you are teaching at odd hours. And how's that benefiting yourself and also the students? So it is fuzzier, I would say, for every country, I guess.
Yep.
Just to follow up quickly what Jasvir and Jana had just said about, I think the pandemic in many ways is forcing us to reflect on what higher education could look like, or what an education hub could look like. I think for Malaysia to sort of orient its hub to the domestic audience, okay, it potentially may happen. That would be quite interesting. But the irony is that then it's a reversal to the original idea of the hub in Malaysia. And my sense is that is not where Malaysia wants to go. At the policy level, it is ambitious to go much further than that, serving its local student population. And even at an economic level, I suspect it is not enough. I mean, ultimately, this is why we've seen since early 2000s, Malaysia has pushed forward to, be much more ambitious beyond its local student population. So what that will look like under the pandemic, I think it's going to trigger perhaps reflections and policy changes within Malaysia. Maybe there's also a lack of choice, right? Maybe you don't wish to serve just your local students, but given the travel restrictions, there's no choice.
I think the question of risk will become more important. So in many ways, like for the institutions, but also for economic strategies. And I think in many ways, focusing on domestic students is a lower risk approach in many ways. And that might be, sometimes that can be a sensible approach as well, right? And I think what we've seen through the pandemic is that countries that are highly marketized and that were very successful in recruiting international students, particularly Australia, have been heavily hit, but also the UK, to the level that the higher education systems are subsidized and relying on international students' tuition fees to an extent that faculty had to be let go. And so this is a very, very acute warning of the dangers of going down that route. And I feel in Germany, we've been very protected from all of these occurrences because we do recruit international students for their experience. And if they don't come, we're sad because we lack out on the diversity in classrooms. But there's not a single penny that goes, or euro cent that goes missing in that regard. So there's no instability in the system at large. And that's very different from what I've heard from colleagues in other systems. And I'm really glad, Jasvir, that you brought in the perspective of the students and what is teaching about. And I feel this is sort of when I talk from this economic lens, this doesn't come through as much, but I feel that both of them, of course, need to be connected. And I think ultimately that should also be reflected in these ambitions and these strategies. So whom are these? Whom is the education hub for?
Yes.
Sort of who is benefiting from this? And is it real estate owners in Johor who are the prime beneficiaries of a particular strategy? Or is it international students? Or is it domestic students? Or is it the regional economy? Or what kind of, who is the key person or the key group of stakeholders that should be central? And I think that is in the strategies I've seen remains very implicit and is hardly ever sort of mentioned in concrete terms. And I think that would be something I would urge to take more central in these discussions.
And I guess the perspective of international students should be taken into account into policies as well, because when I do research, I do ground level research. The end user are international students. Why do they come to Malaysia? When I ask that question to international students in Australia, it's a different ball game together. They come to Australia for PR or for citizenship. But international students know in Malaysia, they are not going to get that. But why are they there? To experience international life, to gain professional and personal growth. And when I ask international students in China, why are you going there? In top universities, their answers are very different. They are there again for international experience. We know we can't work there. We know we can't work while studying. We know we can't work after studying, but we have got scholarship. Why not? Take the opportunity and run with it. So there's so many types of reasoning that these students are coming to different regions. And it's so different than the policy that we are trying to create in every nation. So that's
to take on from Jasvir's side. I now my question is the Ministry of Higher Education Malaysia still looking at the hub concept, given that political interests of the ministry itself is more influential rather than national needs?
And Jack, going back to Jack's point, I think in the middle of our first lockdown, where students were all stranded and students were all sent home, and interstate travel was not allowed. Technically, we cannot leave the district where we are located and things like that.